affordable housing providers in Bend are largely building all electric and doing a really good job of doing that for our capital A affordable housing in Bend.
Yeah.
And have, so just the top line note from builders, I just wanted to highlight that that's not, you know, necessarily including that voice.
And we did talk about that a lot, like
Yeah.
share that. One of the reasons they felt like the middle housing, workforce housing was the biggest opportunity is they were sharing that like a lot of the capital A affordable is already electric. And then a lot of the higher end custom homes, it's sort of easier to build that into new construction planning processes. And there's a little bit less, they saw that as something that's sort of easier, that the market is providing more already, but that the workforce development is where it's not the middle housing is where it's not happening, and that's where there's the biggest opportunity, and it's also a big need for us too, in addition to the capital A affordable. So,
and it also sort of another dimension I can imagine is sort of the timing of that, and whether it actually is sort of maybe just specific to capital costs and impacts on capital expenses versus life cycle costs and full home ownership, especially if we've heard that there's some market distortions where we're seeing sort of subsidies or incentives to new construction that then are covered on the back end, especially on other homeowners. So yeah. I think what you're saying, not necessarily taking every claim face value.
Well, no, just recognizing, working in the efficiency space, that affordability is obviously a very important target, statewide, locally, personally, is super important. And so I just think that affordability piece always needs to take into account examples of people that have been doing it successfully on a cost-effective budget. And I think it also needs to take into account energy costs and the operational costs of living in a building. And those don't always get highlighted by organizations that represent the upfront and the capital component of that, and not the operational piece of that. And that happens and shows up in a lot of places. So I'm just trying to highlight that component, and that we have really good examples of inexpensive installation, or of people that are focused on upfront cost and operation, and the impact to homeowners, and those folks building affordable and workforce housing like Rooted are building all electric. So just trying to put that.
Yeah, definitely. And that was a good part of the discussion we had with COBA. So okay. Any other questions, or do you guys want to dive into the actual discussion? Okay, so the way that we thought we would structure this discussion, we know based on the last meeting that there's a lot of questions about a lot of the different options here. We have two members of our legal team here to help provide some answers to some of those. I want to make sure that we go through and get an understanding of kind of what your thoughts are on each of the buckets, so that we don't get like so much time sort of sidetracked by one or two topics and not get a good sense of where you guys are sitting on all of the topics. So we are going to, what I'd like to do is go through each of the buckets one at a time, and then just ask you on that bucket, what are your thoughts and what are your questions? And that will just allow us to get through each of them. And I'm hoping, so when we do that, if you guys can go ahead and share like this, I think this should be a priority. This is a really big area. I'm hoping that by the end of that, we'll sort of get a sense on if there are ideas that we're coalescing around as sort of prioritized or less prioritized, and get to that, and then also be able to get through everything. Does that sound appropriate? And we read through the questions and thoughts that you guys sent in. So we're a little bit ready to talk about a few of those, but still feel free to share those, because since we have those due on Friday, we haven't had a ton of time with them yet. So if you submitted something into the survey, feel free to still share it here with this group so we can talk about it. Okay, so we will start with the advocacy buckets, and I think we can just cover those two things together. So does anyone want to share their thoughts about advocacy, and to what extent that's a priority for you all as far as something that the city's invest resources in, or do you guys have questions about any of those? And it can be about the bucket or specific policy options.
I guess for me, this is Andrew. The kind of the question that I had is that something that we see as something that Bend is doing alone, or is there sort of a cohort of other cities within the state that would be advocating for the same or similar changes to kind of impact policy at the state level being driven by by just one municipality seems like a pretty heavy lift. And I was just curious if other people had a background on other states that we would sort of coalesce with in terms of pursuing some of those outcomes.
Yeah, I think the way that it normally happens is it sort of depends on the legislation, and the advocacy ones are sort of weird because a lot of them sort of happen. There's a lot of different places you can engage in advocacy and times, and a lot of these are sort of as the opportunities occur. And so sometimes depending on the bill, there will be like coalitions of cities that come together and sort of jointly advocate. We didn't, when we were going through and listing those advocacy, we didn't like assess each one to get a sense of are other cities wanting to mobilize on this. So that would be sort of a next step for us. If there were certain advocacy ones that we felt like were really important, we would start talking to other cities and find out if that's something that they're also talking about or if they're interested in. Definitely wherever you have an opportunity to form a coalition to engage in those activities is better than doing it alone for sure.
Yeah, and this is Mary Winters, the city attorney. I mean, we have a lobbyist, Eric Kanzler, who does presentations to the city council on existing lobbying efforts and when the city should get engaged. If the city of Bend wanted to initiate and then get other cities on board, we would probably reach out to LOC. Scott Winkler is their lobbyist that works with us and a lot of other cities in the region. And if you want to bring something, which we've done,
Yeah.
if we want to bring something forward, we'd work through LOC. And the mayor's got contacts, council has contacts. If there's something in existence, we will know about it through Kanzler.
Exactly.
And then we go to, and a council would always be probably on board, but we watch the short session and the long session for anything that's percolating. We definitely will know.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about, initiating something statewide, if we were focused and had something particular, we would just reach out to LOC, I think, and your contacts, Cassie's, whoever contacts we had and try to, and then you have to find somebody who will sponsor the bill, right? You know how all that works.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that has a lot to do with sort of return on investment for us in terms of the overall prioritization.
Any other thoughts on advocacy?
I mean, if it's a light touch and it's not that much effort, but if there are some real opportunity costs, I'd be really curious what the likelihood of a return on that investment by the city actually is versus.
Exactly. That's exactly my point. I mean, if there were 8 states that were
Hopefully.
pursuing
In the legislature. I mean, Cassie and I worked a lot on the plastic bag ban, and I was the one saying, oh, it'll never happen at the state level. And gosh darn it, we did it. And then some legislator put it forward that session after we adopted it, the state moved it forward and essentially preempted all the hard work we did. So honestly, it happens, especially knowing somebody that'll move it forward through the committees, and it's messy, but it does happen.
I think I was gonna ask what the experience of the city has been. Do you feel like the local effort then translated to a state level outcome?
No, I feel like that was a different city. Some other legislator just picked it up. And so I thought we were so forward thinking and, ahead of everybody, and then it didn't really matter. So sometimes you don't know, sometimes you do things locally in the state. I mean, in many ways, having state policy is better because then cities aren't doing different things. It's kind of confusing to our constituents. So if you can do it at the state level, it's great. And no, Emerson Lee, I mean, we've got some good people that'll help push things forward. So I think it's well worth the effort if you do it.
And there are some things like, as far as like a lot of the regulations go, there are just certain ways where we're preempted, we're just limited from being able to do things. And so state legislation can help address those things. In some cases, the only thing that can help address those. So it can be very worth the effort if it leads to certain, outcomes. We're also investing, I would say, a little bit more recently in our effectiveness in engaging in the legislative session in general at the city and being like a little bit more structured about it. So we definitely have tools, you know, to sort of leverage, if there's something high interest. And so I'm also curious if there were, you know, because we sort of put a bunch of things in those buckets, but was there anything specifically in there that you guys felt would be really worth us focusing our efforts on?
Are any of those policy options under these headings circumstances where the legal vulnerability of the city is much less taking a state level advocacy perspective rather than a local policy implementation? You know, like some of the building.
Yeah, so I'm trying to pull it up on the fly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Let's
just
look
look
at
back
it
up.
too.
Just like sort of some of the building code. I know, because we talk later about local regulations on building code
Yeah.
versus state level advocacy and changes to the building code. And I'm guessing there's obviously less direct vulnerability of the city, but maybe
Definitely.
there isn't a dramatic difference, say, between them. If it's already made it through the filter to be on this list, that there's not a big legal risk that we're worried about.
Yeah, we would have caught most of those things. I know I could pull it up this one too.
So I'm just trying to pull this up and read. No. I would say as far as legal risk on the actual advocacy efforts, very well.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Versus though, if we're thinking about alternative options, kind of like the plastic bag. example you
Correct.
gave,
Mhm.
Doing something locally versus
Exactly.
advocating for something state, that exactly. There has to be less vulnerability, but also.
Correct.
that
Yeah,
lower
definitely. If the state does it,
Correct.
it helps.
And since we don't do our own state building code, like we don't do our own building code that happens at the state level, that's like something where if it just happened at the state level, that's how building code is supposed to be set. So that would be like a much cleaner process. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And the city did engage in at least providing testimony for the reach code bill
Yeah,
back
yeah.
A couple of years
a
ago.
couple years ago.
Yeah.
What's your feel, Neil, from following this in the legislature much more closely? I know that how effective a single city or a small coalition is at state policy like this?
It's a good question. I think that I think highlighting that the city supports these types of efforts and why is a piece of valuable testimony that shows support in a different climate in the state, in a different region of the state. And that's some of where the value of individual city testimony and when the city weighs in individually as opposed to like through the LOC. I think that's some space where seeing other communities that are doing these efforts and what those look like, I think does have some value. I guess that's where I'm a little curious, like looking through the list of how specific we would need to be, right? Like that action that the city took on the reach code bill was from a climate action strategy that said something along the lines of support policies that statewide policies that allow for more efficiency or something like that.
Yeah.
And so this fit under that category. I worry a little bit of just where we're at right now and knowing kind of like what Mary was saying of like, well, we don't know what some other legislator is going to bring up and that is going to need support or whatever those things are. I worry about having too specific of an ask. At least for me, I don't feel like, this is my own personal opinion, I don't feel like I'm at a point where I think my ask to the city is, I think you need to build a coalition to ask for this specific state policy that doesn't exist right now, find a sponsor and get it in the next long session. Like, I'm not there at all personally. And so, but I do think where I do sit personally is if we're recognizing these challenges and recognizing some spaces where state preemption gets in the way, or it'd be more valuable if more cities did something at the same time, having some sort of some sort of statement that council can agree on that's broad enough, but also brings back enough of process for them to support, to be able to weigh in, or if LOC is considering something to say, hey, we support electrification publicly, to meet our climate goals, we want to step in. So that's like on the state legislative side. I think the other side of this, and this has come up in the CCAP piece, is there's an advocacy role in saying our CCAP is reliant on the CPP, and it's reliant, I mean, it's not specifically called out, but it's meeting our climate goals are specifically benefited by these broader climate goals of our renewables targets in the state and the CPP. And so I think having, in trying to put whatever weight the city does have behind the success of those programs, I think also would be valuable, or I would support something in those arenas.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I feel like Bend has created credibility at the state level in housing and like long-range planning. There, because of a successful and really not super controversial in Central Oregon, doing the second UGB expansion and then all the housing work. When we speak, we get listened to because they view us as forward-thinking and able to do things without all sorts of without just a lot of drama. So in the environmental world, it would be really good to start creating that. And now that Cassie has more staff and, you know, to start gaining that credibility for all of Central Oregon in environment and sustainability, because that's when you start to be effective at the state level.
Yeah, that's true.
Are there any two-pronged attacks then of trying to do something locally that then we also say, look, this works and we want to advocate for it at the state level?
Yeah, potentially.
I mean, messy as it is, that is one way that sometimes state policy happens, is enough jurisdictions trying to do something locally. And one way that federal legislation happens is enough states individually doing something, as messy as that process can be.
And there are sort of like the two levels of an resource investment, like, and Neil, you kind of outlined like the ones where we can sort of join and express our support for which I would say we are already doing. So I don't know that it necessarily, I think it could be raised in a recommendation to continue doing that, but I see it as sort of a business as usual for us with the current council. But the part about like initiating something new would be like probably a separate, that would be more like a new recommendation, like let's do something. So it's helpful to hear, Neil, that you don't think we're there on the second one, the more resource intensive one, like initiating ourselves, as long as we're continuing to like put support for things that come up.
Yeah, well, I guess I don't know if the city has engaged in any of the regulatory proceedings around the CPP.
No, not that
So,
one, yeah, not specifically, but.
Yeah, so I guess in my mind,
But
I
like
still
that
think,
type of thing.
I still think there's value in maybe even calling out legislative and regulatory, because maybe our advocacy muscle with our lobbyists is focused on state legislative session. And so highlighting what those key regulatory pieces is something that we could, provide updates for or something. So I still find there to be value in something like we had in the climate action plan, because a lot of these goals are really feeding into this climate action plan too. That was focused on efficiency. And so I think both, like saying electrification is a policy arena that we want to advocate in and support on the legislative and regulatory side. I still support that. And I'm also open if other folks do think that there's specific things that we are ready to make a recommendation for. And I'm assuming that we'll see. I don't see anybody coming out to me. My other comment here, and this is really where like that we're kind of already doing it piece. This is the challenging thing with the prioritization exercises. Is something like that. That's like, I don't know how that fits into the category of, is this something that we need to work on in the next 2 years? Or is this something that we need to do more research on and act sometime in the long term? And how does this fit in its priority with the other pieces? These are the kind of actions that I feel like are maybe not in conflict with capacity like some of the other development pieces are. It's, so I don't know how this would fit in that prioritization bucket that was, that we were asked about.
Or even where we might do something locally with an eye towards a state level outcome, or if we even started to see that some reason it might be cheaper to do it at the state level, that there's more leverage of others' effort than a lot of testing and policy design here. So, and keeping it open in mind between when they're substitutes and when they're complements between the local and state level feels useful. But it doesn't sound like there's a clear yes or no from anyone around the room.
Okay,
I
Andrew,
don't know, yeah,
Lauren,
I'm curious about, yeah,
do
Lauren.
you guys have anything to add?
I sort of agree with what's being talked about by Neil and Mark. I think it's something that is sort of like, for me, table stakes that we should be monitoring and have some clear principles around support. And, you know, we mentioned CPP and some of the other things that are already sort of important for our CCAP. I think the others, it's like, you know, yeah, sort of principles around what we support, and then we evaluate them case by case as things are coming up, and then that can, you know, go to the ECC or to council to evaluate further. But I think having some good, like, I keep saying principles, but whatever we want to call it, around sort of here's generally what we support in this area and where we want to consider advocacy is how I would kind of think about it. But making sure we have enough resources to be monitoring and then evaluating as we go.
Thank you.
Were you gonna say something, Michael?
I was gonna just tell you the lens that I think about this through. There are, to get at the question about legal risk, at least the top two bullets of the sheet that I'm looking at, there's an opinion of ours that there would be very high legal risk for taking one of those two bullets on just at the city level. So there's a clear statute, for example, that says the building code is uniform throughout the state. And so cities can't amend the building code to conflict with the state building code. Then there's this option that we'll talk about later where you can go to the state and say, I would like to do a special thing in Bend. And here's the process for that. And then at the other end of that spectrum is to ask the state to change it. So as we were working on building this chart, the lens that I saw is if we thought that the time, energy, risk, all of the other factors that would go into making a decision meant we wouldn't want to take one of those stronger actions, this would be something that we could do instead. So if ECC or council really wanted to take a building code action, rather than it being either legally infeasible or too much time and effort with a low likelihood of success, this would be another way to look at that type of policy statewide. So we didn't want to just remove it altogether. We wanted to give ECC and council an idea, well, if the building code is the way they think they should do it, this would be a path, and maybe the best path.
That makes sense.
Okay, I do want to move on since we have a lot to get through. So the next bucket is education and support programs. Establish new education and outreach programs to increase public awareness, support informed decision-making, and encourage voluntary upgrades to electric equipment and appliances in homes and commercial buildings. And we have what we have sort of flagged here, ranging from like the more passive outreach and education to the more high touch, like an supportive assistance program. So the first one is a navigation support program, which has come up in the CCAP a lot as well. That would be sort of more like a high touch, actually supporting people making, you know, switching over to electric in their homes and buildings, provide technical assistance for builders and developers. So maybe something sort of similar, but customized specifically to the building and development community on whatever, however we can sort of plug in there. That would be helpful. And then two of the other buckets are more of the passive, just creating new educational materials to encourage electrification in new construction and existing homes, and then promoting the existing incentives that are out there. Again, there's a nexus with a lot of these with our CCAP and things that were sort of included in the CCAP too. So some of these we have talked about. Do you guys have thoughts or questions on education and support programs? And I'm just curious how, because I think the main thing for the education and support programs, especially depending on the spectrum of how involved you make that support. They really can be resource intensive. So wanting to get some thoughts from you all on how important you think it is to do that and spend the resources on it, knowing that in the short term, it may come at the cost of doing some of the other things.
Yeah, that was my main thought, that for this to be useful, you've got to keep it current, and the technologies, the incentives, the policy context is constantly evolving, and someone would have to keep that fresh, and the community would have to feel like they can trust that it's got current relevant information always, which does feel like it could be a lot.
Yeah.
Unless there's an opportunity for some community groups to be playing a big role in that voluntarily with
Yeah.
some kind of validation by the city.
And you can contract like those types of services out too, you know, like a navigator program. So there are ways you could set it up to like make some of that stuff less intensive for the city, but then it would be potentially more costly. Versus having like a city staff person having to spend a lot of time trying to keep current with those things. And then not being as available to do other projects.
I think in the sequencing piece, and I'm curious because I know that Lauren has worked a lot on education and outreach and how it fits into the CCAP. But I think a sequencing piece to me with this is largely a question around some of the other support funding. So education and outreach, in my mind, there's education and outreach about technology and existing programs. And then there's, if you had a clean transition fund or you had funding from one of the other areas that comes up later in the plan, then this changes in priority to me, depending on whether those things are in place or not.
Okay.
But and then I just wanted to add one thing that I just saw last week, last Wednesday, was National Heat Pump Water Heater Day. You know, I'm a big fan of heat pump water heaters. And I saw that the city of Palo Alto is doing beyond education and outreach. They're doing a direct install program with heat pump water heaters where they have contracted rate. And if you need an emergency replacement, you actually call a city number on the city website, and they do the inspection, pre-validation, and contracting, and then get your water heater replaced with a heat pump water heater. So there's a big scale in how high touch, you know, options are, and a lot of that comes down to funding. But
Yeah.
Just recognizing there's a lot of options out there.
Yeah.
Lauren.
Yeah, I was like, I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, to me, a lot of this again comes down to where we fall on other things. I think education and outreach is really great, especially when it will be if it can be paired with some of these other things, like there are incentives available. Now let's do a big program to get those out into the community and help people take advantage of them. Or, you know, if there's some sort of new regulation, how do we educate the community about that? So I think I sort of consider this as something to be paired with other things. That said, like we've done some work already through our existing CCAP to get some baseline education out there, which I think would be great. Sort of finishing that up and getting basic resources out to the community. I think is something we should continue to sort of pursue and get some of that out there. But I don't think that's sufficient. The other piece I do want to add is I think the technical assistance piece for the trades and for builders is important and is sort of a longer term thing that it's something we could get started on sooner, because then by the time we end up doing something, if it takes, you know, a year or two or longer to actually enact something, we will have educated the workforce and created enough workforce in some of these areas to be able to support those programs. So I would sort of advocate for like that one, especially around workforce development, technical assistance, to be something we invest in earlier for some of the things that we're considering down here as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I guess I'll chime in that just at the highest level, this feels like the best bang for our buck potentially, in that if there's private investment that's going to happen or might happen, or there's federal or state funding that's available, to make sure we're steering as much of that private and non-local resource in a good direction. So I always like these a lot, as long as it is adding value to what's already out there and it's done in a way that's more useful than what's already available to Energy Trust or something else.
Mhm.
And so I don't personally know how big the gap is or what the obvious gaps are we could fill. I know always when I'm looking for this kind of information personally, I'm always skeptical of, is this something that actually relates to Portland and Willamette Valley and more of the coastal climate versus our much more extremes here and the like. So having that sort of validation that yes, this is
Right.
from a vantage perspective.
Like when you see statewide resources.
Yeah, and also, yeah, like heat pumps, what's the efficiency of the heat pump in Bend versus Portland?
Yeah, okay.
I,
Okay,
I also just, in general, with education and outreach, kind of working in that field as well. Highlighting that education and outreach just for education and outreach's sake can often not lead to the outcome that you're expecting. You're usually not measuring, because it's often hard to measure what you're
Yeah.
actually trying to change. And so education and outreach can be effective when you've gone through an identification of barriers to adoption, and education and outreach is one of those barriers that might be tied with all of these other pieces as well.
Mhm.
So not relying too heavily on these, and like a lot of these things, there can be, how it's done makes a big difference. So there's some using best practices. We sometimes utilize a tool called community-based social marketing, like trying to think about some of those sticky tools to try to help support, like, for example, somebody recognizing and already going through the thought process of, oh, my water heater's 10 years old. When I replace it, like the fact that the old plumber sticker is on the water heater is a big factor in what they're going to do after that water heater dies. So utilizing tools, not just like posting something on the website that has some information, but like maybe utilizing a tool that is, more invested on some of that behavior change stuff to support people in those transitions.
Cool. Okay. Let's keep moving through because I want to make sure we have time to get what I assume some where you guys have bigger questions. The next bucket is incentives. Some of the ones we came up with was prioritizing or expediting permit applications for all electric projects, development incentives, which is when we're offering flexibility in the development code for meeting electrification requirements. So density bonus, floor area ratio, those types of things. Financial incentive for all electric new construction, a financial incentive specifically for heat pump water heater purchase and installation, and then expanding urban renewal assistance for all electric buildings. So what questions and thoughts do you guys have on incentives and the role that they can play in this?
One of the high level I have is if this is the box where we would want to prioritize the city's pursuit of state and federal in particular funding opportunities that I know we've had a lot of conversation about when there's the bandwidth or capacity to do that, given the scarcity of staff time. Especially if the funding of those incentives is not out of city general funds.
Yeah,
That again feels like a really good opportunity to make sure we're not missing.
yeah.
We don't always get all those.
Well, and I was sort of seeing like anything where it's like trying to direct existing incentives from other entities into our community. I was seeing those as more of the outreach and education, because that's really like the lever that you're pulling then, where this incentives bucket is like, should we be doing something on top of those? Because there are going to be good incentives coming for heat pumps, at least through the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, I guess I thought this might also be where we need downscaling of larger funding pools that might not be targeted at household or individual businesses or the city. Like, a lot of stuff when I talk to Craft 3, what they feel like they're doing is accessing federal funding pools and helping downscale them for individual projects, and even individual communities. But I don't know how much of that is out there currently.
Yeah, I guess I just, nothing I'm not that familiar with that model. It didn't come up in our research specifically, but that would be interesting to look into, yeah.
I mean, basically where there are, what was the big one that we were hoping to go after and then there wasn't bandwidth to go after that?
We went back and forth on the,
Well, the EV one,
new one.
Okay. What was that going to, I can't remember what that was structured like. Whether that sort of, my question really is that kind of effort, would that fall under this box? The city going after, I don't think it's explicitly written that way. I don't think it's necessarily intending that, but I don't know if there's a different place that we would say, make sure that we're going after those kind of federal funding opportunities.
that can then be like redeployed, like in the form of grants. Yeah, I would think, I mean, if you were to choose a city-funded financial incentive for all electric new construction, if that, something like that were to bubble up, we would then look at how are we gonna fund that city-funded incentive? So that's when I think we would do more research into what the options are to create that funding pool. Is that sort of what you're thinking?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's difficult to be proactive on this if you have to be reactive to funding opportunities.
exactly,
Right.
yeah.
That's what I was gonna say. I mean, this is a snapshot based on our research of what exists now. Something could change. It could be new, shiny and great. And then we're looking at, well, do we need to change something in what we chose to accommodate that new thing?
Yeah,
That would be a separate conversation.
yeah.
Right.
Well, that was something we've
But
run
it
into
can-
though with the
but
CPAP
it's
where
a-
we didn't have something
I
as an
think
action.
it can be, I think it can be helpful though to like have, because I think what really doesn't work well is when a grant opportunity comes out there, we don't have like a good model for what that looks like here, and then we try to create a project in the grant timeline, which is like 3 months, and it's just not enough time for most of those projects. So I think it can be helpful to have something out there that's like, we want to do this thing, we need funding for it. So it also helps you be more strategic and looking for that funding and not letting opportunities pass you up because you're more proactively having like a targeted focus on what kind of funding you can look for. You can get creative with the ways you try to find money if you have a specific project. I feel like we've been challenged because we haven't really gotten very specific with our projects, and it makes it harder to then find matches. And then what we do is we hear of grants that are sort of related to it, but we just don't have like a project defined, and it's a real struggle to define a project once a grant's open.
One idea on some of this too is doing something like pilots, right? Where we can find enough local money to say,
Yeah.
hey, we're gonna do X amount of homes or that, put this much money into a bucket. And then we've got an example of something with some data behind it that we can go after
Yeah, I agree with that for sure.
bigger dollars.
But how we fund it, with respect to this discussion, how we fund it is less important to me in this exact moment than like, do you think leaning on incentives, what are your thoughts on doing that as opposed to spending the resources, even just the time, the staff time to develop it compared to some of the other things?
Yeah, this is the tough chicken on the end. I think what I'm hearing is there's support for including recommendations that aren't funded. Not, because I feel like we oftentimes, if those opportunities come up, then there's in the prioritization piece, it's like, well, we don't have funding to do that. And so then we don't, develop the project to be shovel ready.
Yeah,
But if we write the language specifically around that of, developing the pilot and seeking funding, and
Yeah.
that would be, the city has all sorts of funded and unfunded things in the TSP and lots of
yeah,
different
exactly,
places, but
yeah.
I agree that funding or the further developed the project is, the better likelihood you have of actually being able to submit for the next funding cycle.
Yeah.
And that would be part of the project, and that's part of the risk analysis,
Yeah.
is that we would choose to pursue one of these knowing now, well, we haven't identified full funding or full funding. And the risk is that we don't. But because we think there's upside on a particular incentive, part of the time we would take is finding the funding.
Okay.
And I think that when I think about the risk, so to speak, on this, it's that it doesn't end up working out, and it's resource intensive on the front side for something that doesn't end up having a high ROI. But we think the legal risk on this is relatively low. So how do you weigh those two relative risks? I think that is somewhat of the hard question here. And on the grant funding, I don't, this would, choosing to do one of these, part of the funding option would be to go out and look for grants. And I think
Yeah.
we can always keep open if something very specific comes up that's not within what's chosen, that we chose this doesn't preclude something separate. It would just be a separate conversation, but I would think as we go to phase 2 and think about how we might develop one of these, part of that would be to develop the funding strategy, including grants.
Yeah, the way you describe it definitely cranks it up in the priority.
Yeah, it's way better to apply for grants than to have a program
Right.
and to just say, oh, you have money, now we're
Right.
gonna create
never
something and
works,
fit it
yeah,
in,
it
and that's
doesn't
not a
work.
great way to get a grant.
And when you think about Hawthorne Crossing, like the
Yeah.
fact that we didn't have money to pay for the whole thing didn't mean that
Yeah.
we didn't want that, and then it was
Exactly.
having so much such a vision for it is what helped us be so successful in getting so many grants.
That feels like
Totally.
something that'd be nice to make explicit about this action for the public to see that it's not just the city throwing out more tax dollars, but this is a mechanism to bring in money.
Yeah.
to the city.
Yeah, that's true.
And things don't have to be funded by just one funding source. So there is work and strategy to be done in phase 2 if we were to choose to pursue one of these, because we thought there was upside on the result.
You know,
Go ahead.
do you feel like for the purposes of recommendations to council, we though would need to look at these bullets and think about what our priorities are within those policy option bullets, and recognizing that there's even, you suggest there's room for refinement and be more specific.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're sort of free to land wherever you guys want to land, wherever you feel comfortable to land. I don't think it hurts to be specific. We told the council we would help. What I don't want us to do is just not narrow it at all and be like, do incentives, regulations, and education outreach. But it's not that you necessarily have to pick one or two of them. So I think it will sort of depend. Somewhere in between, because if we get too specific, because there's a lot of uncertainty with all of these still, like there's just more research to do. We're sort of in this the vague space of being like super specific. There's a chance in a couple more months of research we could be like, actually maybe that one's not going to work as well as we had hoped. But if we're too broad, then like we're not moving the conversation forward.
Yeah, are there clear from what Parametrics has been doing for the CCAP or the budget review of items here where, like for me, as an economist looking at this, what I'm always looking for is where are the public benefits maybe a little misaligned with the private benefits? Like if it's a system where it really makes sense socially and the benefit is captured locally, like in cost savings over time, that's different from a situation where this is good for the homeowner, but it's actually got all these extra co-benefits for society as a whole that the private owner isn't going to necessarily enjoy. And we need to fill that cost gap to get that public benefit, and the incentive should be sized to, still be less than what the net public benefit is, but hopefully identifying parties that you're nudging them to a behavior they wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah.
So like I don't know which of these bullets are a circumstance like that where there's a big public benefit that the private side might not see, and a little bit of money could go a long way.
Yeah, we didn't get that deep in the
Yeah.
analysis to figure that out. When we met with the builders, they just sort of expressed an openness to all of them, because that's sort of one way to get at that, is talk with the development community and be like, which of these do you see as helping to, would be most taken advantage of?
I guess that's another way to say it though, like where would people use it, but it would also change behavior.
Yeah.
It wasn't gonna have anything.
Yeah, we don't have like that specific of information right now.
Because that's always then combined with education, like ideally you're nudging behavior through showing them the benefit of their own investment too. But if there's just that little extra cost, like places where there's small cost differences between alternatives would be a good example.
Yeah.
And maybe heat pumps are the best example.
Yeah.
I think there's one space, and I don't know if it fits in incentives, or I think it would fit in this category, but I don't know if it's necessarily what we're talking about right now, is maybe it's kind of in here in terms of like density development incentives, but existing programs, existing building incentives that are already there that have program requirements. Those program requirements are available regardless of the climate impact of the project. So could we make a recommendation to include, or I know city council, this conversation came up with, I think Mufti this summer or this fall,
The
late
tiny
fall,
tip,
right?
yeah.
Yep.
Tip,
Yeah.
tip,
Just like
okay.
this
Tiny
tip,
tip.
yeah.
Tiny tip?
I mean,
Okay.
the tip.
Yeah.
Height specific.
So that's another area in my mind that the city could say, if we're giving out incentives to buildings, we're giving out incentives to buildings that meet our affordable housing and our climate goals, or whatever those top line goals are.
Yeah,
Is there some, without specifically trying to have a recommendation for the tiny tip in this, is there some opportunity to, like, I don't know, recommend that in when programs are up for renewal or something like that for it to be,
So, yeah, the short answer to your question is yes.
okay,
This last bullet is in response to that site-specific tip conversation we had. So that's additional urban renewal assistance for all electric buildings. How that actually works would be part of phase 2. Using that snapshot metaphor, we're just looking at what we have now. We could include the identification of and development of additional similar types of incentives for new programs. I'd have to research. I'm not aware of what other programs exist now for existing buildings.
that's why I just don't know
That
if
we
there's
would-
that many.
Yeah. Exactly. That's why. So I included this bullet because, or we included this bullet because we know it exists and the conversation's happening. But it would be some work to figure out what that is. And then if we had something open-ended, it would be kind of like an unfunded mandate. We'd always be looking at whether or not that works, but we wouldn't know in any time frame what the ROI would be on that. And I would want to think about this
Yeah,
prioritization question. Do we want to take potential staff resources away from something else that exists and put it towards a future program that doesn't exist yet?
yeah, because
I would want-
I feel like it's a little bit too general, like for us to just have like a policy statement, like we will add electrification requirements to like
Yeah.
any existing building incentive programs. There's not, those don't come up like all of the time or anything. So I think it would be a little better to be more specific than that. Like, I don't even know what,
I'm
like, I
trying-
don't know
like
what
racking
form
my
that would
brain
take
to think
in.
of others where we, for existing buildings, that we could add this in a way.
well,
I'm
what-
racking my brain.
I mean, I was thinking that this would be more new construction, not.
Oh, I think
existing
'cause you just-
building.
I don't know.
Oh, maybe I
feel like you
misunderstood
brought up-
you.
Yeah.
So
But even
bullet
new
2,
construction-
bullet 2 is what is in a kind of a 1-sentence summary of what Portland is doing. So that would be new construction. So that would be incentives in how we administer our development code for new construction.
Okay.
I think based on our research, that would be the best way to capture it for new construction. I think Mark, sorry, Pierce, I think your questions in this, going back to that, do we pick one or all? I am to kind of give my 2 cents as we develop these. I think there are a lot of unanswered factual questions here. What really is the investment? So, 2 of these are city-funded initiatives. What does that look like? Is that cash out the door? How much cash? Whether or not that's cash out the door and how much relates to what's the benefit. And how do we figure that all out? There's a lot of unanswered things here. So when I look at this one, including your question about existing versus new and existing programs, I think this might be one where you do pick the bucket and you say, there is a lot more work to be done in this. We like the idea of incentives for XYZ reasons. There's a lot more work to be done here. So we want to spend our phase 2 work figuring out, Mark, what you just described. Because I don't think we know yet. And I don't think, at least from our research in Oregon, we haven't seen data generally or specifically to Central Oregon or Bend that explains how all that how that math works.
And if we want to stay broad, the only thing I would add is that I think that's when the prioritization is going to become really important, because the answer can't be figure out the best incentive and figure out the best regulation. And the next biennium, we're going to need some, we can't do all of it at once. So that's where the broader you go and the more that there is to like figure out is also like sort of a bigger body of work, if that makes sense, to figure out. And so it just has implications for the other things we can do, if that makes sense.
Are there any clear lowest cost options And I'm thinking from the conversation with the builders, like the prioritization of permit applications sounds great, but I don't know if
So
there's
there,
legal risk.
the way that I think of, I mean, so the first two bullets, prioritize or expedite permit applications, and then these development incentives. Kind of by definition, we're not taking a check and giving it to somebody.
Mhm.
Whether or not the opportunity cost of the first two bullets, how that works in relation to developing a program that creates a new amount of money that cashes out, goes out the door. I don't know. So on the surface, to me, I think the easy answer is bullet 1 and 2 are easier because we're not actually generating funds to pay them. But it may be that we find out that the opportunity costs for those things on the other externalities are so high that it ends up actually not being easier or less costly for society, for to use your words. I don't know. I think that's where we would really want to spend phase 2 to dig into it in a detailed way to try to get at those answers, potentially with data, which I think some of the focus groups said that they really wanted us to get to. So I know it's not a satisfying answer, but I think
No,
that's where we are.
No, I think that's a satisfying answer, and it also, it speaks to something I was gonna mention also, sort of like the idea of a tax shift or fee shift, and if there's something that we're pairing with a fee on the lower section, where we're charging people more for things we don't want to do, and funding the incentives for things we want them to do. I don't know if there are, again, legal challenges to like fees on some kinds of construction, or new fees for everybody, but you get an exception if you're doing this, those sorts of
Yeah,
things.
but the fees issue you'll remember this, you watch the tree code discussion, it's just the unreasonable cost and delay, and there's a lot of sensitivity in our community to fees already, and every time we say we're gonna, but it doesn't mean that you take it off the table, it just means you go into it knowing there's a lot of sensitivity with housing costs already. I will say with the prioritization, I've just been in meetings with our planning department who has consistently said, we already prioritize affordable house, certain kinds of planning, building permit processes and planning processes, and there is no slack left to do anything else. And if anything, our building is down right now. So the number of planners is barely keeping up and is probably going to go down. So I want to set expectations on that one, like with the tree, it was a hard no from the planning department. We cannot do it. It's too big of a list already, and we're barely keeping up with the priorities that we have, that we've already agreed by code to prioritize.
And that was sort of the builder's feedback on that one. The reason they weren't that enthusiastic about it is they're, being the ones that are dealing with that, they are sort of seeing that like we can't, it's not that meaningful when we're prioritizing so many things as it is. And so it's just like
you're bumping everything, and
they don't really feel like it's
yeah.
specifically effective because it's sort of been tapped out. And I think even where it's tapped out, it's not like as fast as you want it to be to make like a really big difference. And there's just real limitations in being able to, like, it sounds so nice and that it comes up in every discussion, every incentive, because everyone feels like it's the easy thing. But to make it meaningful is not actually that easy.
You're talking like maybe a couple days. I mean, we already have a 120-day clock in Oregon. So we've already got time limitations on planning staff. So when you're trying to squeeze out a little bit more, it might be a short amount of time. So again, it doesn't mean you can't move it forward if you feel strongly. I'm just trying to expectation set a little with what the plan, before we even have to do a lot of research, you have to talk to the planning department and understand where they're at with other prioritization.
Well, what's funding more at FTE, and it's like the pre-check line, that there's a whole separate line with dedicated staff or something, but.
Yeah, I mean, you could dig deeper into
You
it,
could
I
dig
guess.
deeper.
To me, that's a phase 2 question.
Yeah, that's a potential.
But
And
it's,
then that would
something
be
that
like
could be on
a
the table.
council policy question, like, do they want to fund a new position for all electric buildings, and how does that weigh with other things that we're also trying to accelerate and prioritize?
Yeah, part of it is how important is that time delay to builders, knowing would that really change their behavior?
Yeah, I just know this conversation has been had in.
It's
every
been had a
single
lot.
area, so,
Yeah.
and I think there's an element of when something is given that priority, it's really hard politically to take that back. So it's not a true prioritization of, at this moment, this is the order that we have. It's once you have that accelerated thing for this thing, it's going to be really hard to pull it back. And so I think we're just at the tail end. Like, we don't get the advantage of first mover for that piece, but that's okay.
Mhm.
So I guess I have a question just using that tiny TIF or whatever it was as an example. There's the public benefit piece that's always an option. So that's essentially adding another incentive or another area of, if you prove public benefit, you might get something better, right? So that's adding another thing that might make it a little bit better. There's also requirements of getting the incentive at all, the base level requirement. So, and that was my memory of that description. So I'm kind of imagining this of, yeah, there's two categories. One could be, can we make the incentive slightly better if you do all electric? Another could be, can we bake some level of climate goal, which might involve electrification, into the requirement for incentivization, which is different than requiring it for new construction. And like just broad scale, you know, if we're looking at new construction, there's the areas that we already incentivize. And so I guess my question, because I don't think we have time to dive into all the details of that, knowing all the things that we're looking at. But my question is, that tool of limiting those benefits to all electric buildings and new construction, legally, do we have more legal flexibility in restricting incentives on electrification rather than requiring new construction to be electric? Or is that a path that you could address?
I think he's asking like,
It's not urban renewal specifically.
well, you're saying,
No.
but that would be incentives in general, right? I don't think there's any legal restriction on incentivizing certain things. Like we can incentivize what we want
And
for the most
if
part.
the building permit, if that's considered fees, if that's considered an incentive versus a regulation, I guess
depends on
it
the type
depends
of
on
incentive.
So I'm
what you're
trying to
talking
understand,
about.
sorry,
Yeah.
so to use the analogy of the site-specific TIF,
Mhm.
we had a policy that said you have to meet these eligibility criteria. If you meet them,
Yeah,
you get this baseline amount.
Yeah.
If you go above them, you might get more.
Yeah.
That baseline criteria didn't involve anything related to environmental issues. It was a affordability question.
right.
But there was
could
something
have-
that,
It's what-
that's exactly.
Yeah.
So are you asking whether or not if we create a program where we're voluntarily spending money, either through urban renewal or something else,
Uh-huh.
could we make electrification a eligibility criteria?
Yeah.
So you don't get that money unless you meet, that would be a new program, a new type of incentive program.
I mean, I could do that.
And I think the answer is yes. If the city decides it's going to spend money in a certain way,
Yeah.
that we could define the program. There would be there are always legal parameters, but
Mhm.
we could define the program to say, we want to spend some money on an incentive for electrification. And unless you clear this hurdle, you don't get that money at a very high level. Yes, and that's what we did with affordable housing.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes, I guess I'm not necessarily thinking down the line, or I don't know if it would be a new program just for this, because that seems kind of amorphous, or I'm more wondering of the existing programs that we already have. But that's
So-
maybe where the existing word came up. Existing programs we have for new construction.
It's
So,
really just the TIF. I don't think there's others,
so
yeah.
in the context of urban renewal.
Well, I mean. Oh, sorry.
Go for it. So the
I
answer
think
on
there's
this,
lots of ways that the city's structure incentivizes other things that maybe isn't just on a tax basis, but we have implicit incentivization for ADU construction with reduced SDCs. There's lots of like little small examples of what those are that.
so I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. So
Yeah.
if there's called a barrier to
Uh-huh.
something, could council or borough, depending on who it is, amend an existing program to remove that barrier or some portion of that barrier for electrification?
Uh-huh,
I would want to look at that program by program.
uh-huh,
I don't think there's a general answer we can give. But overall, if it's an existing city program, council or borough within some legal confines
mhm,
does have some leeway to define the terms and conditions of that program.
okay,
So if we wanted to add a bullet here for phase 2 to say, do a comprehensive review of what I'm calling barriers, whether it's fees or something else, and
Mhm.
could we remove that as an incentive instead of creating something that's cash out? I think that's something we would want to look at phase 2,
okay.
because we have not looked at that.
That's a good way to
Is that a
define it.
better-
Yeah.
Is that, but I would want to look at it case by case,
Mhm.
because we still need to have a base, there still needs to, and this is what came up with the site-specific TIF. There still needs to be a programmatic basis for that incentive, whether it's money out the door or removal of a barrier. So just picking one that's an incentive for something that has to do with something totally unrelated to, and just adding this, that would have more legal risk than it was already something that was connected to an environmental policy basis.
Okay.
So I just want to look at that.
Yeah.
I think that's the phase 2 question is, let's do the inventory and let's see where this might fit. If we find some places, then we can see how it might work.
Mhm.
And that would be a phase 2 process.
And I think all of those things are meant to be covered in these buckets. So like the ADUs, if they have reduced SDCs, which I don't know the details of that program, I would see that as a city-funded financial incentive. It's in the form, it's not a check to them, but it's in the form of reduced SDCs. So I think that, no.
Well, no, yeah, that's in our SDC methodology, so that's the kind of.
That's why
that's
yeah,
a big
I know, and
thing,
that's why I keep
yeah,
saying, I know this
that's
isn't a
big
super
thing,
satisfying
yeah,
answer. I'm
yeah,
trying to
that's
say
kind of a big process.
that the whole,
Well, right, which is
But
why,
how I
which is
see
why
it
then
is-
we would have to create a new program if we're gonna
We
like
would.
apply this on top of
that's kind of how,
something.
that's kind of what, like, we haven't, this snapshot of where things, like, we put together the kind of like top 5 things where we think these are the way we're seeing other cities do it, where we think we might be able to do it. These are the types of incentives. You know, if you take 5 of them, because we can't put the entire universe in a spreadsheet, here's where we think you should look.
Yeah.
I am personally an advocate for this bucket of taking the whole bucket to phase 2 to do some of the type of work we're talking about.
Mhm.
Because I think this is a place that really merits that deeper dive to look at some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even begin to want or know how to comment on the feasibility of all of the different types of city programs where a fee is charged and whether or not we could remove that fee to incentivize something. That gets so, it's very,
Yeah.
very complicated very
That's,
quickly.
and that's
So,
fine. I know we have to move on.
Yeah.
I think I'm just trying to think, I'm trying to use recent backwards examples
Yeah.
to try to say,
Totally.
what could we have had
Totally.
in place?
Yeah.
That would have accelerated or
Totally.
maybe further developed, because I think oftentimes environmental public benefit
Totally.
gets brought up in city opportunities like this as, should there be an environmental benefit? I don't know, maybe we make it lead. If it's lead, it's good. That's not a well-developed policy that I think will make change. So I don't know how to give recommendation for how to have enough background information and buy-in and support without to get that to actually happen and not say, well, we're waiting on this next policy
Yeah.
thing, we're waiting on this next development thing, and then it doesn't get.
I think an investigation of that in phase 2 could be part of a recommendation to council as again, as balancing out what we're looking at, but
Yeah.
as something that would want to be prioritized to figure out what
Okay.
the best bang for our buck is.
Yeah, it seems like that's the key to this one, is being very specific about what that phase 2 is and what some of the questions are and what the outcome is, where the outcome maybe is just one, like phase 2, we're going to pick one bullet, and we're gonna do these things, and the end of doing these things, we're gonna pick one.
And that's where I guess we can add, move the process forward. If you guys pick a whole bucket, like giving some direction within that bucket of sort of like the questions that specifically need to be answered and that sort of thing. I do want to move
okay.
on because we still have like 2 of the biggest buckets left and we only have 30 minutes. So the next category is local regulations. So these are the ways that we can implement new restrictions or requirements to reduce fossil fuel use in new or existing residential or identified commercial construction. So the 2 regulations that we included in here was looking at a NOx emission standard, and then or enacting benchmarking or energy performance standards for buildings. The energy performance standards, the models that I've seen are primarily focused on commercial and multifamily buildings, where NOx is something that can cover all buildings. What questions and comments do you guys have on the local regulations bucket?
Could we revisit the focus on NOx? Is it because it's easier to regulate than GHG in some way, or that these co-benefits of avoided NOx has all these other environmental benefits as well? I know there's a lot of good precedent about NOx and why NOx is important already in their act.
Like why NOx instead of something else? Like instead of greenhouse gas emissions directly? NOx is just the model that we're seeing right now. We haven't really seen, because we sort of grounded the research in what are other cities doing or pursuing. There was very little information about someone trying to regulate based on greenhouse gas alone, except that there was an example maybe by the state of New York, but or just New York City.
Just really different laws on.
And no one else has done that, I think, because just regulating greenhouse gas emissions seems extremely difficult to me.
Right.
The NOx part, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest uncertainties around NOx for us in a city in Oregon is that we don't really know the answer to that question because we're not an air quality district and we don't have expertise in air quality. But that is the one that people have coalesced around. I don't know, Meredith, in your research, you've like heard more about it. There's since it's air quality, it has air quality benefits. But I feel like people sort of back into it as cities are and different jurisdictions are sort of backing into it post Berkeley. I don't think it really came up that much before Berkeley, before the Berkeley case got overturned, but as a different way of addressing natural gas. And I think because especially in the air district boards in California, they have a pathway to do that there. And it felt like maybe the next easiest thing for them. So I don't think it was like a direct comparison, like NOx is better than this, but I think it's easier for the people that are, at least for the California Air Resources Boards. I don't know that we feel like it's necessarily
Yeah,
gonna
I
be,
think easy might be.
Yeah.
A little bit of a strong statement or stretch, yeah, but, and I don't know how much Ian talked to you about this a bit at the last meeting. I mean, we'd have a lot more work to do. I'm super interested to see if something actually comes out of Ashland, because I know and we've been watching, but so far there hasn't been anything that with the outside counsel they're using. As Cassie just said, we have spent some time looking at what's happening in California, and it is exclusively from what we've seen at these air quality districts, like the San Francisco one is Alameda, San Francisco, Napa. I mean, it's a whole bunch of counties, and they are not regulating new development. They're regulating in phases, like starting in 2024 up to like 2031, different kinds of buildings when people change out appliances. So they're just doing furnaces and water heaters, nothing else. And it's when you change those appliances, they have a lot of data just looking at their websites on connecting within their basins air quality to why they're regulating, which of course is not something that we do in cities. So whether cities have this kind of authority, I mean, they did it through rulemaking, and the rules, like the South Bay, the Southern Air District, I was struggling finding good information because it's this long, highly scientific and technical rule. So the the Bay Area Air Quality District has a really good website that kind of explains their program a lot better. But it's an air quality district, and they have a rulemaking process. There's also a California Air Resource Board that's actually phasing out natural gas appliances by 2030. So they've just got the way they do their EPA, as I understand the California system, has been taken over by their air quality districts in a way that looks unique to California to me. So what is the mechanism in Oregon? How does DEQ regulate? This is just outdoor air quality. We'd have a lot of research to do. I know just from my experience with COVID, and we adopted a bunch of public health orders, like when we restricted people coming here to short-term rentals and hotels and mask orders. It was kind of fun. I got to go into the CDC and write all this scientific medical stuff, but I did use local data, like how many deaths are we, all the stuff, like we could tie it into the county health data. That doesn't, from what I found, that doesn't really exist for air quality with NOx emissions in Central Oregon, at least not in quick research that I could find. So it's kind of a long way of saying, if you want to move forward with that process, I'd love for another city to get out ahead of Bend, for sure, and see what challenges come, because it looks like not a straightforward path based on what they've done in California, because it wasn't cities. What we like to see is, here's a city that's adopted codes, because codes are what we know with findings. None of that's happened in California. It is rulemaking through districts. So they're models and they're ideas. I would say right now that's what they are models and ideas, and solving a problem through a particular mechanism. that has not been tested by cities from what I've seen anywhere, certainly not in Oregon. But it's being talked about, so
Just a lot of uncertainty.
a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's no doubt it'll be litigated. I'm sure there'll be preemption, there'll be all sorts of reasons, like I can come up without boring you with it all, like all the things you could do if you wanted to say, you can't do this. I could also come up with ways we could say, oh yeah, we can, we're a home rule authority, we have police powers, all. I will say I'd feel a little better if we were a county, just because they have public health authority, cities traditionally don't. So that's just something for us to think about. But probably, after a lot of time and research and thoughtfulness, and what do you want to regulate? Again, looking at California, they started with residential, then they go to water heaters less than, you probably know what this means, 75,000 BTUs, typically residential. Then they do between 75,000, then large commercial and multifamily. So it's all phased in. Doing existing, I have no idea what their staff levels are and how they even know when somebody's changing out a water heater or a furnace. Like for us to do it on existing, like the way they're doing it down there, I can't even imagine how a city could know and figure that out. So as I understand from Ashland, at least looking at one draft they had early on, was they were looking at new development. That would be something new. That isn't the model that we're seeing out of California.
So besides all these sort of regulatory limitation uncertainties, just the basic chemistry of this though, is that natural gas consumption generates NOx. And that's the most clear and obvious co-pollutant that you're getting from natural gas. There's no other one. And it's not something you can avoid through, say, scrubbing, or you end up with, say, some offsets of NOx, but still using the same amount of natural gas. I see NOx come up in a lot of ways in terms of the actual nitrogen deposition issues on habitat. And when I worked on water quality trading, that was always a big deal where you were worried about atmospheric deposition of NOx and whether the limiting factors between phosphorus and nitrogen, what was driving eutrophication, things like that in water quality. But it's not tied into any of those things. It's the cleanest, sort of policy cleanest way to limit natural gas consumption.
What about tying it to our Central Oregon air quality? Because that's what I see from their data down in the Bay Area. They actually have numbers tying it to, not like I get the national and global issue, but what about tying it to air quality here?
And I think it's
knowledge
NOx is a pollutant that the EPA, or that there is at least it's a pollutant that is regulatable.
Yeah,
outside, it's not a preempted thing from the federal government. And so that's where the potential opportunity as a pathway has been identified. Is that right?
Well, again, down in the Bay Area, no, they actually have findings about the air quality in these places and tying it to health impacts in their localized air quality. So that's the connection. I'm just wondering if you all have any knowledge of here, whether there's any tie to the air quality in Central Oregon
Yeah, it seems
that
like
we could use if that's how we want to regulate.
Okay.
like if we're gonna spend city money to improve the air quality here, I'm sure this isn't the most efficient target.
But I don't think that limits your legal capability of doing something if it's not the most efficient.
No,
where
but I'm just getting at how efficient this action is, and just so we're sure we know that this would lead to a CO2 emission. Right, that this idea is, it's not a circumstance where you're gonna end up with some opportunity to scrub from NOx, CO2.
I see where you're going.
Yeah,
Or policy.
Like if people can comply with low NOx, but then they're not complying with low GHG, it's a risk potentially.
Yeah, they're actually not prohibiting the appliances. They say right now, there's none that can meet these.
Right.
They don't prohibit natural gas appliances. They just say they have to meet these standards.
So like a
And they
new appliance could come out that somehow eliminates NOx.
Potentially,
I don't know.
yeah.
But
I assume if all these places are doing this, that's gonna be a pretty obvious question. But
Yeah.
Just since we're not targeting it, I mean, the air quality thing is a nice little benefit, but
Yeah.
again, I think there are other air quality targets we have around smoke, for example, that make a lot more sense. to us.
Yeah, it's not something I've heard people talk about with respect to this, so I just don't know the answer.
Or even socks or some other, like,
Yeah.
socks, if there's other kinds of things you would target, but. This used to be such a big deal with acid rain and all that, no one really thought that, and I don't know how important NOx emissions are here in Central Oregon. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's either tied to the air quality or it's tied to public health. That's the other justification I've seen. You don't necessarily need to have data on what the particulate matter is in the air, but is this actually reducing health effects locally? That might be another justification why they're looking at NOx. It may be tied to, co-benefit with GHG, but it's also, well, breathing NOx hurts you, and so let's do less hurt.
Yeah.
That's data I don't have
I
either.
tried to find out on the
Talking about
county
COVID, that's
website,
all
and it was
county.
indoor. They
So I
didn't
think-
have outdoor.
My understanding from NOx, that's one of the other reasons they've looked at it is it's not just the air quality, and it's also how, I mean, I know they're tied together, but it's also the health justification.
No, and
So-
that's great and important. And I'll say in the last few years, the environmental economics field has gotten really excited about all kinds of new research that showed that sort of indoor air quality investments are the best way you can improve child
Exactly.
education, attainment, all these type of things. So like, in a lot of places, they say that's like the lowest hanging fruit for investment on environmental regulations, like indoor air quality. But I don't know to what extent.
But to answer your question,
Yeah.
we, the city of Bend have not done the scientific analysis in the city of Bend right now to understand all of the different effects of trying to regulate, assuming it's all legal, which is a whole nother set of questions, but scientifically, whether in Bend regulating one chemical or emission versus another, what the marginal impact is going to be. That's not research I've seen in Bend.
No.
I'm not sure I've seen that research, but I think that was your original question. Why NOx? That's a scientific question that we haven't answered.
Yeah, and your question, at least from what I've seen from the California model, is the health benefits that they seem to be looking at. And again, there's a lawyer talking science, so take it with a grain of salt, but it looks to me like it's all outdoor. The indoor, I think, is more gas stoves. And they're not regulating those. Like
I
fewer
don't think
regulated
there's-
stoves because they're not as bad environmentally, but they don't vent outdoors. They're only regulating what vents outdoors because that's what they have authority over.
And I think there's limited low NOx, there's not a low NOx standard for stoves, and so it's just not able to be regulated under the same mechanism.
It may
So
be,
because
but
that's from indoor air pollution, that definitely is a serious concern, but there's
That's
just
the
not a
concern.
pathway to
Exactly.
regulate from what I can tell, and that's one of the, I guess, co-benefits of the fact that water heating and space heating do have low NOx standards,
They
and that
do,
those are
yeah.
the two largest users of gas.
They do.
That,
But I think they also
There's
just
just
have jurisdiction over outdoor air quality.
Right.
That was my understanding, is that that's what they do. These air
Yeah.
districts is outdoor. Indoor would more be like county public health. I
Yeah.
think they look at indoor. So, and that was Cassie's very early question, like, what do you want to regulate? That's something at some point you're gonna have to consider.
I do like options that have a clear local benefit as well. And if there is a clear local benefit for air quality and public health, indoors and outdoors, I think that seems great.
We only have 15 minutes. What other questions, Lauren? I saw you just came off mute.
Yeah, I did have a question on like who does have authority over these things
In Oregon?
in Oregon? Like, is it DEQ? Like, what is, has there been rulemaking on some of these things already from a state level or other places?
I haven't seen, this is Michael, I haven't seen any, I would think it's a state and the state public health authority and DEQ, because there's a nexus for both environmental quality and public health. I haven't seen anything statewide on this yet, or maybe not yet, but I haven't seen it.
I mean, the state has regulations already on commercial,
Yeah.
but it's the state DEQ would be through the EPA, and county public health has indoor. If you go on their website, they have a section on indoor air quality, so they'd be another, entity.
And it's the state statutes that,
Yeah.
to the extent they govern it, that may or may not, and this is where that legal question comes up, provide some room for the city to act. We don't know, but that room would be created by the state because it's the state authority that generally would regulate in those two fields.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, I feel like for this one, it feels like there's some initial research we could do, like, dive deeper and to answer some of these questions in sort of like a phase 2. I don't know how other people are feeling, but
Yeah, well, I'm curious, we've talked about Knox. I'm sort of curious how you guys feel about like investing time into creating a broader building performance standard, and then also just your overall thoughts on regulations as a bucket and the level of priority, given, I think the main thing that you're hearing is that there's just so much uncertainty. It will be a lot of time. And with the outcomes being a little bit uncertain. So I think I'm curious where you guys feel about those in relation to focusing efforts on incentives, and I would still like us to try to get to fees in the last 10 minutes that we have.
I mean, I would love to have the discussion about fees and not dive into prioritization right now, just because I think we could spend the last 15 minutes talking about prioritization.
Okay.
And we have 2 lawyers in the room and staff, but I'm happy to share my opinions, but I just
No, we can
would
move on.
rather-
Would you guys like to move on?
can I just say on the benchmarking one really quick? I think it's worth diving deeper on this one, partially because I looked at the numbers in Bend and I don't have them in front of me anymore, but I think 60% of our commercial buildings are under the, like, what would fit under the current state requirement. So I think it's something that's worth considering. And Cassie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a group that's sort of thinking about carrying this down locally. So anyway, I would be interested in exploring that one further on the because the commercial is, just as big as residential here. So I think it's important to look at.
Yeah, I would like to talk more about regulations at some point, but not now.
Okay. Okay, what questions or thoughts do you have on the fees bucket? And the 2 that we have are a new building permit fee. This is like other cities are doing fees where they're sort of coming up with that fee based on the anticipated gas use of the building. So that's one way we can structure that fee. It doesn't have to be that way. And then the other fee-based option would be to increase the fee on the natural gas utility. What questions do you guys have about those?
I wonder if there's sort of a scaling issue on this, and maybe you have things similar to the SDCs and thinking about higher costs for larger buildings, and if there's sort of, from a legal perspective, if you're protecting some basic subsistence, basic needs level of use, but then as you go up, so it's really sort of targeting, if you're going to be a huge house or a huge building and you're also doing natural gas, that's where the fee kicks in, and that you would get around the affordability question that way.
I think, I think that seems doable.
Like a development of the policy,
Yeah.
that you could address some of those concerns.
Yeah.
Yeah, by having tiers like we do in other areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the one of the questions that I think you brought up with fees is, in this I've been thinking about the goal and the public benefit that we're trying to maximize is, there is a public benefit to electrify buildings and clean up our electricity source. That's the pillar that I think this whole question is being asked on top of. So what tools we take to get there, both from a political question, which we're not going through today because it's not even on the list, around limiting new regulatory limiting new construction connection to gas in the first place, in terms of expanding limiting gas development in the right of way, expanding that's not even on the table. So if we're not saying no, then trying to have a strong enough incentive to try to internalize some of those impacts of developing at the time where it's the most cost effective to make that decision makes a lot of sense to me. So I think that having a fee for new construction, if that's the only path that we have for new construction, it's such a big opportunity in new construction. Sorry, this is super rambling. Such a big opportunity in new construction. And so having a fee that's internalizing some of that public harm from having a life cycle of appliances installed and the gas use associated with them, I think makes a lot of sense and could shift a lot of behavior because we have a lot of limited tools at our disposal. I think just clarifying, the goal is explore the electric alternative and choose electric. I think I can't think of many examples where we've taken public impact of like the social cost of carbon into account. And so I imagine the fee would be relatively high in my mind, or I would like it to reflect the social cost of carbon, which might be a high enough fee that it I worry that would be highlighted way more than, well, it's cost effective in new construction to just build all electric anyways. And so I don't know if there's a structure or a narrative or how you share that, but that's really the path that we're trying to encourage. This is really just opening up the option for those that don't want to comply by building all electric from the get-go. And if it's scaled based on anticipated impact, then I would imagine a fee would also be scaled based on its anticipated gas usage is what was envisioned. And so that would differ as to what appliances you're connecting to. So if you just wanted to have your gas connection for your barbecue and your fireplace, that's different than if you have water, space, and everything else.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we're trying to generate revenue and change behavior, all of those. And I know there's not time to put some supply and demand curves up on the water, and I'd like to, but I think just being deliberate about that, and I don't know legally that makes a difference if we're trying to change behavior versus generate revenue for other programs.
I'll just encourage you to think about, I mean, it came up in the briefs on the tree code challenges, the fee was, which, may not end, we'll see if we end up litigating, but that fees are now challenged because of a US Supreme Court case called Sheets and saying that things like fees have to be proportionate and have an excess. So that kind of argument is out there. So I guess I would just encourage us more to think about the fee as not so much trying to achieve maybe social and behavioral goals and more to mitigate the impacts of the development, because there is our safe space. We can mitigate the impacts of the development, but if the fee is trying to do something more, it will make it harder for the lawyers to defend.
Can it be behavioral, but revenue neutral, or even taking the revenue and using it to make it more affordable in some other way?
I mean, it just goes back to the very first case that started this whole thing for cities was out of Tigard, a bike ped trail and a project. And they were trying to connect up the very good benefits of a bike ped trail, and the city of Tigard lost. That started the very first whole Nolan Dolan thing. And it was exactly, and it was said, great, it passed. This is a good thing for the city to want to do. What it didn't pass is that was proportionate to the impacts of the development. There was so the city lost, and now honestly, with this Supreme Court, the law is just getting worse and worse for cities. So I didn't used to think that things like fees should even have anything to do with Nolan Dolan, because that's not saying you have to build something like a trail. That used to be my opinion as a land use lawyer. The Supreme Court has shown me wrong, and that assessment of what that whole takings clause was intended to cover. So cities are just being cautious. So I would just say we have to make really good findings if you ever want to do something like a fee on why are you doing it. And general social benefits, they may be good things, but they're problematic for us.
And then also the point you brought up earlier on housing and and
Yeah.
cost and delay, and
That's a
so
whole nother one.
just
Yeah.
in the residential housing sector,
Yeah.
any
that'll be
addition,
argued.
any additional cost could be subject to a challenge that it's unreasonable cost for housing.
Yeah.
And so that would be another potential avenue for challenging our program if we decided to do a fee kind of, and this is what Ashlyn was looking at this, the way that it's written in the sheet is, be at the building, it would be part of that building process. So it could be susceptible to a challenge. We don't know how courts interpret unreasonable cost and delay.
Yeah.
There's no
Again, it
guidance
doesn't
at
mean you
that point.
can't do it. It just means go into it thinking,
Exactly.
what are the impacts, and be reasonable and be careful, not try to get too much, like completely disincentivize anybody but using electricity. That's probably an overreach according to the courts. That would be a lot. for us
Here's
to do.
another, just a quick idea here. Instead of imposing a fee, I wonder if it's possible to impose sort of two types of analyses. So in other words, in order to get a permit, you would need to, or an applicant would need to submit kind of a life cycle cost analysis and a greenhouse gas analysis for both options, and then just submit an acknowledgement that, like, if they're going to go the greenhouse gas route or the fossil fuel route, just an acknowledgement of like a higher life cycle cost and or a higher environmental impact.
Well, we sort of talked about, Michael, the idea around adding additional permitting requirements as a disincentive. And what Andrew just described to me falls into that category.
That would, this all comes down to actual cost and what's reasonable and what's not, and all of the type of analysis Mary's talking about. But I think that idea of adding hurdles in that development process you start to get in risky territory in terms of putting a lot of effort towards something that we can't say will be upheld. And I think when I hear that, that sounds like a big-ish hurdle, but it all comes down to what's the actual cost and what's the actual time it takes to do that. And I don't know. That would be a phase 2 question to try to get some data on cost and delay, for example, requiring something like that as part of the development process.
I mean, the reason would be to educate them so that they're understanding. What would be the rationale for requiring that kind of report?
Is it just if they were using gas, they would have to do that, and if they were using electric, they wouldn't have to do that?
Yeah, but
Or
is it,
if you're trying to keep it even and make it less, more defensible, just say that's an added step to the development process, irrespective of whatever the fuel source is. And I think, through education, like you can't, it'd be effectively the same outcome as like a city's benchmarking requirement and what that's about. It's about drawing people's attention to, the impact. I read a couple of places that folks were really interested in, at least on the industry side, about making data-driven decisions. And I think that's an example of putting more information in people's hands and, possibly like a little bit of social pressure when you are acknowledging, yes, I'm doing this. It's a higher social cost, environmental cost, but potentially a lower first cost. But it might be borne out that it's a equal or cheaper life cycle cost.
So it would be just informational. It wouldn't necessarily be directly reducing the natural gas use.
I think over time it would, but I think that would be the net effect. But it's a way of not imposing additional financial cost.
Is it who pays? Sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding the proposal. Who pays for those analyses?
I think it's going to be it would be, I mean, anytime you build a house, you need to do a heat load calculation that shows how you've arrived at sizing your heat appliance. And so that would just be an additional step for the engineer, but it really, frankly, is not a lot of extra work.
So let's say Polish is doing a subdivision. So for all the homes in phase 1 of the subdivision, so that's going to be before a buyer, it's going to be the developer. They would need to do a life cycle cost for all, homes in the approval process. That's what you're proposing.
Something like along those lines, yes.
So, I mean, it is to me, a phase 2 question. What does that
Yeah.
look like and what does it cost and what are the benefits and how does it fit in with that sheets analysis of what is the impact that we're mitigating?
I think the challenging thing here is this whole category is like, we have to justify a nexus and a proportionality. Generally.
If it's on,
speaking,
if it's
right?
on development,
If it's
If
on
it's on
development.
development, yeah.
On development.
and then if it's on housing, it has to be, reasonable cost and reasonable, can't
Okay.
be unreasonable.
Yeah, so the
double
proportionality, nexus and unreasonable cost and delay.
Yeah, correct.
Are just thinking about our process, all of those things seem like we could brainstorm very specific pieces or not. Those to me seem like phase 2 things, and we do those 3 things with every policy that the city ever does around development and housing.
We did.
Right? So how helpful is it for us to dive into the detail of what we're recommending at this point if we're gonna have to, we're like, I don't know, like to me, the social cost of carbon is one tool that could potentially be used to scale something based on the proportional to impact piece. I don't know if that's been tested. I'm not a lawyer. That's just my idea. So we just say, we are interested in this as a tool. We think that this might be a pathway. Look at it in the next 2 years.
I agree with you. I think
Okay.
what we're talking about now is a phase 2 question.
Yeah,
I think what one of the challenges will be is this prioritization. I know we're
Yeah.
going through and kind of not hitting that quite head on yet.
right.
That will be the challenge, but I think if this is what we want to explore in phase 2, all of the things we're talking about that's that data-driven analysis.
Yeah, and that's the hard thing
legal
to
risk. That's the hard
prioritize
part.
too, because if it's like, we only think that there's a proportional scale of a $50 fee for natural gas connection. If that's what we heard from you of like,
Yeah.
this is it, it's $50 or we don't go through
Yep.
it, then that's totally gonna change how we prioritize things.
Yep.
And we live in a squishy world and I'm
Yep.
comfortable making recommendations in a squishy world, but I guess if you have specific feedback on that, because I think that that's the pathway that other cities have been considering, is the scale of the impact in the scale of social cost of carbon. If that's a tool that you think we could explore, or if that is not a pathway that has been used, or wait, you can come back at the next meeting for something like that.
I think this one does carry some risk. I think what you just mentioned could be a benefit of choosing this, is that we may not be the first city that does it. So we may be able to draft off another city to figure out what may or may not work and actually see something.
And the nexus is more clear for sure
So,
compared to other fees.
Right,
yeah, I think
So
this
the
is
nexus
one.
is
Yeah, the
covered.
nexus is not that hard. It's the
Yeah.
proportionality and then the
cost.
unreasonable cost. So it's more, is it the number ultimately
Yeah.
we want to propose, you want to propose?
is there any way on, so the unreasonable cost component, are there examples of how that has, and you can share it out, had that been, okay,
It's like, there's,
Yeah, there's been a few cases
I
on
don't think published, but yeah,
delay more.
Okay,
I don't think-
Yeah, of
is
like,
more of an issue.
does that, if that were to get litigated, or if you were trying to do the analysis to try to say, we think this is reasonable, and this is why, here are the 2 ways we see of complying with this housing mandate or requirement. We see a pathway in this way that costs this much.
Yep.
We see it, the total dollar difference is
Yep.
the squishy piece in
Yep.
my mind. But if you can show those 2 pathways, like, have cities, do they work with the builder? Like, I don't know how to look at that, or how you all look at that.
This is, it's kind of a fascinating one in Oregon, honestly,
Mhm.
because we've got the current governor and this legislator passing more laws than we can keep track of, trying to get more housing and the cost of housing down. So
Right.
there's you all read about
Yeah.
massive push in Oregon, and middling all housing, get the cost down.
Mhm.
we also have a very strong environmental commitment in Oregon.
Mhm.
They collide all the time. So the question you ask, it is going to be hard for us to find a clear and easy answer. It's just going to have to get tested.
Right,
I think our job is to try to, like, when our clients want to go too far, and
yeah,
it just feels to us like we can't defend that because what they're saying on the record is not consistent with the law. That's what we'll try to bring you back. And then you just have to do something. Sometimes you just have to act, but it has to be within the realm of like trying to, I did this with short-term rentals with a new council that didn't like the fact that we regulated short-term rentals and was like, can we raise the license fee so high that nobody wants to do one? And I was a no, you cannot do that. I think that is inconsistent with the law. So it has to be like, what is the cost for processing short-term rentals?
Mhm.
I would say the same for this. It has to be somewhat to get to the impact, not to say, this is how we're stopping electrification by driving it up so high that nobody wants to do it. That would be extremely hard for us to defend.
But are you saying that there's no opportunity to justify social impact beyond city processing impact fee?
I don't know, we'd have to look at that. I mean,
Okay.
social impact, I would probably want to phrase it more as environmental impact of the use of natural gas. I mean, I
Right.
think that's a true, and I know we're starting to look at that with actual economics. So it would be fun to write those findings
Yeah,
on what is the, you know, not just local, but state and national and worldwide, what are we learning?
Mhm.
What are the courts going to do with that? It's hard to say.
Okay, we are about 10 minutes over, so we need to call it for today. I think at the next meeting, next week, we'll come back, we'll have a quick discussion on the building code, but I think we need to pretty quickly shift into prioritization. So I'll try to think about how we can facilitate that. Because we're hoping to land on something by the end of the meeting next week.
right.
And even just sort of the exercise of trying to do it ourselves beforehand, like a survey kind of thing, or even.
Yeah,
like
we
that
can
could
send
be
that out.
helpful.
Actually, that is a good idea. I will send out a survey and ask you guys to rank your prioritization. Does
And we're
that
gonna
sound
do
like?
it, we're gonna do it at the bin of, not the bullet policy.
I think based on the discussion today, staying at the bin is probably appropriate. Do you guys agree with that?
Feels like it, especially with the caveats we'll give on what phase 2 looks like for them.
And I think that there's a discussion to be had also about like the roadmap. Like I know, knowing this group, it's gonna be hard for anyone to say, we just are not gonna do any of these things. So I'll try to think about if there's a way I can ask that in the survey, but I think like, even if your answer is that we need to do all of them, talking through like a sequencing. So if the question is just prioritization, I would think about that in terms of like order of doing things, maybe. I'll think about the survey and how to best frame that.
Yeah, I think it's like just, there's 8 buckets, put them in order from 1 to 8 with the nuance of 2 hours of nuance that we've already had. And the other thing, they just fill very different buckets and not like, it's gonna, I don't know if that's super helpful, because some of the things like advocacy are like, well, we're kind of already doing it, this is making a commitment. There's other things that are like, we have to do a whole bunch of analysis. I don't know, it's a tricky piece to just
I
say
know.
my favorite.
And this is sort of this hard spot we're at with this whole process is like, again, we're trying to narrow the discussion a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately the main goal you guys need to get in front of council is like how to narrow and focus and prioritize us. So
yeah,
we just have to come up with what you guys think is the most important thing to message to them.
Okay.
In order to direct that. Okay, thanks everyone. And for those of you in the room, we didn't dole out lunch in the middle, but we do have lunch for you. So feel free to take it. Yeah, we have plankers. Okay, thank you, Andrew and Lauren,
Thank you.
for anyone listening online.
Hi, thanks.
We'll talk to you all next week. Okay,
Yeah,
bye.
thanks for all the work on this internally.